Hey guys, and welcome to a very special episode of Robostoph's Fireside Book Chat. When I started doing this whole booktuber thing, it was Whitley Strieber's Communion that prompted me to launch my book discussion series. So that video and that book will always hold a very special place in my heart. And I'm very excited to revisit the topic by discussing the sequel to Communion, Transformation. Before we jump in, I want to be perfectly clear that I'm not making fun of Whitley Strieber or anybody who claims to have had this visitor experience. So, to summarize this one, in this book, it's a follow-up to Communion, where Strieber attempts to dive a little deeper into what he calls the visitor experience. However, by Strieber's own admission, he seems a little less confident that the entities that have abducted him are extraterrestrial in nature, and he explores other possibilities. Although he doesn't directly endorse anything, he maintains a position that what he experienced was genuine, yet undefinable. However, he does believe the visitors are physically real beings. Timeline-wise, Strieber is telling us mostly about the time directly after the events in Communion, where more bizarre things happen in his cabin located in upstate New York. He makes several attempts to overcome his fears and embrace this experience head-on. However, it's in the details where things start to fall apart, and despite his best efforts to convince us that he's telling the truth, the story just doesn't really seem believable. But the question isn't really whether or not we believe it, it's does he believe himself? Strieber attempts to set the stage in the first half of the book by highlighting various unexplained phenomena throughout history, and not so subtly implying that it could be his visitor. This was actually a fun exercise because throughout the book, Whitley Strieber introduces me and the audience to interesting phenomenon throughout history that still largely is unexplainable. Of those, one of my favorites is the Secrets of Fatima, also called the Miracle of the Sun, where over 30,000 people witnessed strange solar phenomenon. This was in like 1917 or something like that. And these three children foretell that the Virgin Mary will appear. And so all these people gathered up, and sure enough, they all really did see something unexplainable in the sky. To this day, it's still unclear whether this was mass hysteria, UFOs, or some genuine religious event. With that being said, these portions of the books are actually pretty effective in softening my mind towards the possibilities of what Strieber calls his visitor experience. After all, even the most rational among us have probably almost certainly experienced something at one time or another that defies our expectations, especially when all rational explanations fail to live up to our own personal reality. For instance, when I was a teenager, I experienced a few things that I would consider to be paranormal in nature. One of those events I wasn't alone for. I was sitting on a couch with my friend, and we saw this orb-like thing float across the room, and it sort of warped the wall behind it, kind of like predator camouflage. And the next thing I know, it moves towards the rocking chair in my living room, and the rocking chair began to move on its own. Like I said, I was not alone. My buddy saw this as well. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. In my teenage mind, I immediately went to spirits, right, or ghosts of some kind. To this day, I don't doubt what I saw, but I do lack the conviction that what I witnessed was paranormal in any way. I say this because I believe that in this book we see Strieber wrestle with some of these same doubts. And that's what makes me believe that he is sincere in many ways, and at the very least is on a genuine quest for answers, and those quest for answers aren't coming at the expense or gullibility of his audience. But despite my belief that he believes, I can't in good conscience suggest that any of the things he personally claims to have experienced should be considered true by anyone other than himself. And mostly because it's all, well, pretty silly. Despite going through great lengths to set the stage for the audience when it comes to the things that Whitley has claimed to experience, it all just seems a little bit too much and yet not very much at all. For instance, much of the book is spent with Whitley trying to overcome his fear of going outside at night. And he's afraid to go outside at night because he can sense the looming presence of the visitors. It's somewhat endearing and yet simultaneously ridiculous. Throughout the book, he makes attempts to contact the visitors and embrace them. But there's really no scientific method in any of the way that he conducts his personal experiments. So it really just kind of enhances that idea that this is all happening in his head. Especially considering how much of this experience seems to happen in obvious, like dreamlike states. He's visiting golden cities, and he's been given vague prophetic information by the visitors. But when it comes down to it, there really is no evidence. Also, despite the title of the book being Transformation, I never really got the sense of what Strieber's ultimate point was throughout this entire book. For a while I thought maybe he was trying to suggest that we're being somehow mentally conditioned to experience a transformation of some kind thanks to the visitors and evolve in some way, but he never really touches on why the book is called Transformation, and if he did, I totally missed it because it's buried in all this other mumbo-jumbo that he's going on about. Much like Communion, Whitley Strieber likes to pretend like all of his experiences have happened in some kind of vacuum, and that he hasn't been influenced in any way by other forms of literature. He even named some of those things that he couldn't possibly be influenced by, like John G. Fuller's famous article in Look magazine from the 1970s titled Aboard a Flying Saucer. But he suggests to us, the audience, that because his experience is so similar to that experience, that it makes it genuine. I've pondered this at great length because this is something that I've probably held against Strieber the most, especially in my past video. But I have started to wonder if maybe these similarities in the experiences that people claim to have is more than just fantasy. For instance, there's a part of the book where Whitley Strieber talks about how he mastered astral projection after reading Robert Monroe's book, Journeys Out of the Body. The things that Whitley described here are absolutely ridiculous. For instance, there's a scene in the book where he describes how he projected his astral form and voice into the rooms and minds of other people. And the idea of Whitley Strieber appearing in my room like the great and powerful Oz made me laugh out loud. However, it did get me thinking of my own experiences with sleep paralysis, as I often enter a dreamlike state where my body is asleep but my mind is awake. For me, it's mostly unpleasant and kind of feels like a nightmare that I can't wake up from. I'm aware of my body and my surroundings and like the room that I'm in, but I can't wake up, usually. The only way for me to wake up is to try and wiggle my fingers and toes, and oftentimes I will attempt to scream, but I'm unsure if I'm actually screaming or not. I am generally aware of my surroundings and my physical location, I just can't move or wake up. The closest I can describe it is sort of like when you take a nap in the car, and you remember all those songs you heard on the radio, but you couldn't interact with your environment. I don't offer this to explain Whitley Strieber's own objective reality, but rather to illustrate something that I believe I have in common with the author, minus the visitors part. Sleep paralysis is pretty common, and when I heard of others who have had this experience, it makes me wonder if Strieber's visitor experience is not a matter of a conscious reality, but of an unconscious one. This idea led me to Carl Jung, who in the 1950s wrote Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky. In this book, Jung explores the place that UFOs hold in our unconscious minds. He explains that in this new technological age where people used to see creatures of folklore like angels and demons or fairies and goblins, we now see something that matches our technological expectations, which would be flying saucers. After all, the height of the UFO phenomenon really did start with the beginning of the nuclear age. Jung attempts to explain psychologically how UFOs are manifested in our unconscious minds. And he analyzes dreams and things of that nature throughout his book. But he never really tries to tackle the more physical sightings that people have seen that are corroborated with radar. He mentions them, but he doesn't try to explain those away. He simply focuses on what's going on in the mind. However, I found this to be rather interesting because the funny thing about dreams is we do all have similar dreams oftentimes. Many of us have had that high school dream where we're running around in a maze of lockers and we can't get to our class on time. It's interesting because many of us deal with the same anxieties and they manifest similarly in our dreams. But imagine how powerful that experience would feel if those dreams were of a religious or paranormal nature. And what fascinates me further is if UFOs are an evolutionary step in our dreams and our collective unconscious, then what's next? Perhaps imaginations really are just running wild and people are seeing whatever it is they expect to see. For instance, I personally have always wondered if people who believe strongly in things like demonic possession are more susceptible to it because of that belief. And does that belief, should they fall victim to such an invasion, would it match their cultural expectations? Interestingly, people who do psychedelic drugs often report having very similar experiences of a religious nature. I read The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross and found that certain mushrooms were used to elicit certain religious experiences. And it got me thinking and got me wondering, are we hardwired to have a religious experience? And if UFOs are just an evolution of that, is that somehow hardwired into us to have these type of archetypal dreams, as Jung would put it? I do wonder if somewhere in our brains we're coded to reach for a higher power. I'm not sure that I'll ever believe that Strieber's visitors are physically real, but my mind is always open to the possibility that we're not alone in the universe, because, after all, I'm out here in the darkness in the middle of the night, looking at an infinite sky, and I find it incredibly hard to believe that I'm all alone. I don't claim to know one way or the other, but I do find the whole thing to be highly fascinating. I also believe that in Whitley Strieber's 40-year quest for answers, there's something in his heart that legitimately believes what he is saying. But unfortunately, he's just kind of a master of hyperbole, and additionally, he uses techniques where he throws all this stuff at you, and as soon as he says one thing that kind of resonates with you, you're more inclined to listen or believe what he's talking about, even though it goes against all your rational intuition, because clearly what he's saying is complete bullshit. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.